This is U.S. History Regents Review, Unit 2, Video 7. We are talking about the start of the Civil War. The election of 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was elected, was the final trigger that starts the war. And this is because pretty much no southern states voted for Abraham Lincoln. They assumed that as someone from the North, that he was going to try to get rid of slavery. Even though that was not his goal, that was the assumption, and they were basically done with the Union. South Carolina is the first to make this decision. They secede, which means leave the Union. And eventually, several other states follow and form what's called the Confederacy. The current president, James Buchanan, because remember, presidents stick around for several more months even after the election, he doesn't do anything to stop this. So these states have declared that they're not part of the United States anymore, and he does not act. And Lincoln, eventually, when he does take office in that March, a month later, Fort Sumter is bombed by the Confederacy. This is a fort in South Carolina, outside of Charleston, federally held, but it's in South Carolina. So South Carolina goes ahead and bombs this arsenal. Lincoln lets them do that and gives up the fort, just to make it clear that the South is the one that's being the aggressor. So this is the start of the Civil War. Remember, a civil war, that term, is when there is fighting within a country. We have Americans killing other Americans. And as the war starts, Lincoln says his main goal is to preserve the Union. Above anything else, he wants to keep the country together as one country. That is the oath he took as he became president, to protect and defend it. So while he personally hated slavery, he also did not plan to get rid of slavery in the states where it currently existed. In his political career so far, he had talked about stopping it from spreading to new territories, but he was going to leave it alone where it already was. So let's look at our two sides. The Union, which sometimes we call the North, was led by President Abraham Lincoln, and General Grant was in charge of the military. And the Confederacy, the South, was led by their elected president, Jefferson Davis, and their general was General Robert E. Lee. Now, you'll notice there's also some gray on this map. What is the gray? The gray are border states. These are states that did have slavery, but also were not willing to secede from the Union. So they stayed loyal to the Union while still owning slaves. So they're all right on the border. It's a document time. We're going to look at the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln. And you're looking over here at a picture of the whole thing. And this is the whole thing, minus just a couple sentences. This was made after the Battle of Gettysburg, which we'll talk about, when all these soldiers had died. We actually are going to see Abraham Lincoln change his mind about the slavery issue. While he was originally not willing to address the slavery problem, as the war continues and things get more and more horrible, he decides it has to be about something worth more than just getting the country back together. It has to be more meaningful than that. So he says, 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So he's referencing the birth of our country, the Declaration of Independence. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. Literally, they're standing at Gettysburg. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who have gave their lives that the nation might live. So we're under a big test, he says, as Americans. This vision that our founding fathers had for our country, can it survive? And he says, it is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. He says we must live on the legacy that those who have died have fought. We have to finish their work. And he doesn't say it, but what he's really talking about is slavery. We have to end slavery, and we have to prove that our democracy can work. It can survive this. So the actual Civil War, what do you need to know? You don't need to know all of the details of the battle strategies. I'm sorry for all of those of you who absolutely love military strategy. Basically, the main things to know: the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation means freeing. Lincoln declares that all slaves in rebellious states are free. Now, this doesn't have any huge immediate effects because he's making a declaration about states that are not considering themselves to be states right now. So they're not going to be free immediately. And he also doesn't free slaves that are in the border states, only the rebellious states. But what it does do is it sets the tone for the war as it continues, that as the Union goes to these states and takes over areas, they are liberating slaves as they go. So this is a huge turning point. And he says it's a war measure, that as the commander in chief, he can confiscate property as part of the war. He makes a controversial choice to suspend what's called the writ of habeas corpus in the border state of Maryland. That is a right for citizens that allows them, if they've been arrested, to be brought before a judge and to know why they're being imprisoned. So Lincoln is taking away people's civil liberties because it's a time of war. That's a huge theme for any war. And we see him do that here because he wants to make sure the Union wins. Battle of Gettysburg, that's the main turning point. It's the most awful battle of the war. It has the most casualties. It is also when the North really starts to win. The South is physically destroyed during the war. Almost all the battles are down in the South. And one major example, General Sherman has his infamous March to the Sea, where he just like torches all these fields and destroys everything. This is an example of total war. And meanwhile, some of the northern factories are actually making money because they're able to manufacture weapons of war. That's another theme we see during wartime, is usually somebody is making money from producing things needed for war. So what's the significance of this war? The Union does win, and the war ends. First and most importantly, perhaps, other than winning the war, is that Lincoln, at the end of the war, he wants to make his Emancipation Proclamation permanent, and he fights hard for it. And he pushes through the 13th Amendment, and slavery in the United States is abolished. Sadly, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated and does not see the end of the war, but General Lee does surrender, and the war is over. But as we're going to see in the next unit, reuniting a country after they have killed one another is a very, very difficult task. So this war results in a big legacy of bitterness and division. But it permanently settles the question, finally, of states' rights. Whether a state can reject a federal law, nullify it, whether they can make their own decisions and just break off from the Union if they don't like it. The answer is a resounding no, it cannot. And a huge success for our Union. And the United States has remained united ever since.